Have you ever felt that you shouldn't go somewhere, even when it was something simple, ordinary, almost automatic? Sometimes it's an invitation you accepted on impulse. On paper, nothing seems wrong. Familiar people, a normal environment. But hours before leaving, something begins to weigh on you. It isn't clear fear. It isn't a logical thought saying, "This will go wrong." It's a quiet resistance. You try to ignore it. You keep getting ready, but your body feels slow. Time seems to stall. Every detail becomes an excuse. The clothes, the time, the tiredness, and along with that comes guilt. I'm exaggerating. I'll look strange if I back out now. This makes no sense at all. This is the most delicate moment, when intuition still speaks softly and reason begins to shout. Think of an ordinary person. After a normal day, they get ready to go out. Nothing special. A quick meeting, a simple commitment. But as they close the door, something tightens in the chest. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't paralyze. It's just a mild, persistent discomfort, almost polite. They pause for a second, hand still on the doorknob. A thought comes quickly. If I back out now, I'll look weak. And then comes the hardest decision. Not the decision to go, but the decision to stay. They make up an excuse. Go back inside. Sit on the couch without fully understanding why. Minutes later, the feeling fades. In its place comes a strange sense of peace. Not euphoria, not exaggerated relief. Just the impression that something was avoided. Days later, they discover that in that same place, on that same night, something happened. Nothing cinematic, nothing that would make the news, but enough to make them think, in silence, if I had gone. This is how premonition usually works. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't explain. It doesn't impose itself. It suggests. And the conflict isn't in the warning. It's in the moment when you have to decide whether to trust something you can't justify. Because trusting intuition in that moment isn't a mystical act. It's an act of inner courage. You don't know if you're right. You just feel that moving forward would cost something invisible, and even without proof, you choose to listen. That's where most people silence their feeling. And that's exactly where the question that changes everything begins. Where does this voice come from? The one that doesn't speak, but insists. Let's imagine a few situations where reason silences feeling. After that moment at the door, reason steps in, and it doesn't come quietly. It comes armed with arguments. You're exaggerating. There's no reason for this. It's just tiredness. You always overreact. Reason doesn't ask questions. It corrects. It points to the confirmed invitation, the organized schedule, the exchanged messages. Everything looks too normal to be questioned by a simple sensation. And so you go. You go to the meeting that seemed harmless, and during the conversation, something starts to reveal itself. Small comments, misplaced looks, a growing discomfort. Hours later, you realize you entered a situation that drained you deeply. Nothing serious, nothing tragic, but something that didn't need to happen. Reason defends itself. There was no way you could have known, but deep down, you knew. In another scenario, reason wins again. You ignore the impulse not to sign that agreement. The numbers looked good. The proposal made sense. Months later, the problem appears. Poorly explained clauses. People who weren't transparent, and that sentence returns uncomfortably. I felt this wasn't right. Reason calls it coincidence. But the repetition starts to bother you. Curiously, when someone listens to feeling, reason only appears afterward, apologizing. The person who didn't go to the meeting and later learned about the conflict, the one who refused the partnership and avoided a silent loss, the one who left a place early and escaped something that doesn't even need to be told. Reason only accepts premonition when it turns into fact. Before that, it treats it as an enemy, because feeling offers no guarantees, and reason hates what it can't control. The conflict isn't simple. Choosing feeling requires accepting an invisible risk, the risk of looking illogical until you're right. And that leads us to an even more uncomfortable question. If feeling gets it right before the facts, why do we insist on silencing it? Premonition almost never begins in the mind. It begins in the body. Breathing changes before thought. It becomes shorter, shallower, as if the air doesn't fully enter. The shoulders stiffen without warning. The hands grow restless, searching for something to do. None of this draws attention at first. They're small, automatic adjustments, almost invisible. It's the body reacting before you understand why. Many people describe a strange sensation in the stomach. It's not nausea. It's as if something retracts inward, asking for caution. Others feel a sudden weight in the chest, not tight enough to become pain, but uncomfortable enough not to be ignored. What's most curious is that these sensations aren't accompanied by images, thoughts, or negative scenarios. There's no catastrophizing. There's no clear fear, just a quiet internal adjustment. When the person insists on moving forward, the body responds. Breathing becomes irregular, presence disappears. The mind speeds up to compensate for the physical discomfort. But when they stop, when they decide to listen, something reorganizes. Breathing deepens. The chest relaxes. The body returns to balance, even without rational explanation. This relief isn't psychological in the usual sense. It doesn't come because the problem was solved. It comes because an inner choice was respected. It's as if the body says, "Now we're aligned." And that raises something hard to ignore. The body seems to know before the mind. It reacts before thought. It warns before decision. The question that inevitably begins to form is, who is using the body to warn? If the body reacts before the mind, then premonition can't be just a physical reflex. In Spiritism, this anticipation has a clear explanation. The one who perceives first isn't the brain, it's the spirit. According to the doctrine organized by Allan Kardec, the human being is composed of three integrated levels: the body, the mind, and spiritual consciousness. The body executes, the mind interprets, but it's the spirit that perceives. While incarnated, this perception doesn't happen directly. It passes through layers, and each layer filters, distorts, and limits. That's why premonition doesn't arrive as information, but as sensation. The spirit perceives a possible imbalance, a future inconsistency, a field of risk, an experience that doesn't align with your path at that moment. But when it passes through the brain, it doesn't become a sentence. It becomes tension, discomfort, a physical alert. Spiritism teaches something even deeper. The spirit isn't bound to the immediate present in the same way the body is. It doesn't see the future as a finished movie, but it perceives tendencies, probabilities, sequences. Like someone who sees the beginning of a storm. They don't know exactly when it will rain, but they know it's not time to go out without shelter. Premonition is born from this expanded reading. Spiritism also affirms that we live in constant spiritual exchange. Not as something mystical or exceptional, but as a natural condition of existence. Thoughts attract thoughts. Emotional states attract similar states. Consciousnesses influence one another. At times, premonition doesn't come only from one's own soul, but from a protective inspiration, a silent warning that deeply respects free will. That's why it doesn't push, it doesn't force, it doesn't compel. It only warns. And here's a decisive point. In Spiritism, premonition isn't a privilege and it isn't a special gift. It's a natural faculty of the spirit. More active in some, more dormant in others. What determines whether it manifests clearly isn't belief, but inner state, emotional balance, attention to feeling, and moral responsibility. Perhaps that's why premonition is so uncomfortable. Because it reveals something hard to accept. Not everything that happens to us begins in the mind. Some choices arrive already asking for awareness. When premonition begins to make sense, something else arises, the fear of being wrong. Because if spiritual perception exists, the inevitable question is, does every premonition come from the spiritual world? In Spiritism, the answer is clear. No, not every inner sensation is a warning. Not every discomfort is spiritual. Not every impulse deserves to be followed. Human beings also feel fear of loss, emotional exhaustion, insecurity, accumulated expectations, and that's where confusion begins. Example 1. Relationship, emotional confusion. A person lives in an unstable relationship. They wake up with a tight chest, restless, constantly on alert. They interpret this as premonition. Something is wrong. I feel it. But in this case, the feeling doesn't come from spiritual perception. It comes from fear of abandonment, accumulated wear, repeated anxiety. They act as if it were an external warning. They confront, they pressure, they decide impulsively. Later they realize it wasn't an alert about the other. It was an internal request for care. Example 2. Work. Exhaustion disguised as intuition. Now think of someone overloaded at work. Constant pressure, little rest, a toxic environment. A sudden urge arises to quit. The body is tired. The mind is saturated. The person says, I have a premonition that I need to leave now. But when they look calmly, they realize there's no clarity, only extreme fatigue. They decide impulsively, quit without planning. Months later, they face financial insecurity and regret. The problem wasn't listening to feeling. It was confusing exhaustion with guidance. Example 3. Family, old emotional history. In another case, someone avoids visiting a relative. They feel discomfort whenever they think about it. They call it premonition, something there isn't good for me. But what actually exists is unresolved history, stored resentment, unspoken conversations, repressed emotions. The feeling isn't warning about a future danger. It's pointing to an old wound. Confusing this with spiritual warning is avoiding inner work. These examples show something essential. Not everything we feel comes from outside. That leads to another delicate question. Do good and bad spirits influence what we feel? According to Spiritism, yes, but always respecting free will. Influence happens according to attunement. Disordered emotions generate confusion, not clarity. That's why we make mistakes. Not because premonition fails, but because we mix everything. Warning with fear, intuition with desire, perception with fatigue. True premonition isn't loaded with urgency. It doesn't pressure. It doesn't disorganize. It is firm and serene. And perhaps the safest criterion is this. If what you feel pushes you toward rushed decisions, it's not guidance. It's emotion asking for attention. When science speaks of premonition, it starts with the brain. According to neuroscience, the brain is a prediction machine. It analyzes patterns, past experiences, micro-expressions, environments, and it does this before consciousness realizes it. Premonition, in this view, is the final result of unconscious processing. Nothing mystical, nothing external, just data being silently organized. This explanation is solid and, to a point, sufficient. It explains why someone feels something before being able to explain it. It explains why the body reacts before thought. It explains the how. But here comes the first limit. Science starts from a fundamental assumption. All perception originates in the brain. Spiritism starts from another. The brain doesn't create consciousness, it expresses it. This difference changes everything. For science, premonition is anticipation based on the past. For Spiritism, it can be a reading of future tendencies, made by a consciousness not bound to time the same way the body is. Science asks, what data led the brain to this conclusion? Spiritism asks, who is perceiving these data before the mind organizes them? Another point of separation is this. Science explains premonition even when it fails. It says prediction error, false positive, cognitive bias. Spiritism also admits error, but doesn't attribute it only to the brain. It attributes it to the mixture of spiritual perception, emotion, and human desire. Here lies a subtle but profound difference. In science, premonition is a byproduct of the mind. In Spiritism, it's a faculty of spiritual consciousness, limited by the body and emotions. Science doesn't work with moral intention. It describes processes. Spiritism does. It states that a person's inner state, emotions, ethics, balance, directly affects perceptual clarity. That's why two people in the same situation can feel completely different things. For science, this is subjectivity. For Spiritism, it's attunement. And there's a point where science simply stops. It can map brain activity, show which areas light up during premonition, describe correlations. But it doesn't answer the most unsettling question. Why does consciousness perceive something before having sufficient information? Spiritism doesn't try to replace science. It begins where science ends, not to deny the brain, but to suggest that it may not be the origin, only the instrument. And perhaps the conflict was never between science and spirituality. Perhaps it was between two different questions. Science asks, how does this work? Spiritism asks, who is aware of this beforehand? After everything that's been said, perhaps the discomfort isn't in premonition. Perhaps it's in admitting what it implies. Because if something in you perceives before the mind, then it isn't true that you only decide when you understand. You decide much earlier, and use reason afterward to justify. How many times did you know you shouldn't continue, but continued anyway? How many times did you feel your body freeze, your chest tighten, your presence fade, and still move forward, and then called it bad luck, coincidence, just part of life? Maybe it was none of that. Maybe it was simply you refusing to listen. Science can explain the mechanism, Spiritism can explain the origin, but neither explanation resolves the central point. What do you do when you perceive before you understand? Because premonition doesn't take away your freedom. It exposes your responsibility. It doesn't force. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't punish. It simply makes it clear that you weren't unconscious. And that's what's most uncomfortable. It's not comfortable to accept that you perceived and still chose to ignore it. It's not comfortable to admit that some pains didn't come from chance, but from decisions made against what was already felt. So perhaps the most honest question isn't spiritual or scientific. Perhaps it's personal. What do you gain by pretending you didn't perceive? What are you avoiding when you call the warning imagination? To what extent is your reason protecting you, or simply hiding you from yourself? Premonition doesn't demand belief. It demands courage. The courage to admit that, in many moments, you didn't fail for lack of information. You failed for lack of presence. And that realization doesn't ask for an answer now. It simply remains in silence. After so many uncomfortable questions, one thing must be said clearly. Premonition is not a command. In Spiritism, feeling something doesn't mean receiving an invisible order. It doesn't mean you have to act. It doesn't mean someone decided for you. Premonition exists to expand awareness, not replace discernment. This difference is fundamental. Many people err not by ignoring feeling, but by idolizing it. They treat every sensation as absolute truth, and that's as unbalanced as ignoring everything. Spiritual responsibility begins when you understand that premonition is a signal, not a sentence. It asks for pause. It asks for listening. It asks for inner honesty. And here's a rarely discussed point. Emotional state contaminates perception. Fatigue distorts. Fear amplifies. Desire directs. Anxiety creates artificial urgency. So before trusting what you feel, you must ask, what state am I in when I feel this? Spiritism doesn't teach escaping reason. It teaches placing it in the right position. Did you feel something? Don't react. Observe. See whether the body is tense or simply alert. See whether breathing is shallow or steady. See whether there is haste, impulse, or desperation. Legitimate premonition doesn't run you over. It doesn't demand immediate response. It tolerates silence. When it's true, it doesn't conflict with moral conscience. It doesn't ask for unjust actions. It doesn't push towards selfish decisions. It doesn't encourage escaping responsibility. This is an essential criterion. In Spiritism, perceptual quality is linked to inner maturity. The more emotionally unbalanced a person is, the more confused feeling becomes. Not because bad spirits dominate, but because internal noise prevents clarity. That's why spiritual development isn't about seeking signs. It's about reducing interference. It's learning to tolerate silence, sustain doubt, not act just to relieve discomfort. True premonition doesn't come to relieve anxiety. It comes to guide conscious choices. And perhaps the most important point is this: the spiritual world, if it exists, doesn't protect from consequences. It warns. It suggests. It inspires. But experience, pleasant or painful, remains part of human learning. Spiritism doesn't promise that listening to premonition avoids all pain. It promises only to avoid unnecessary pain, and that already demands a lot. Because assuming spiritual responsibility means accepting that. Not everything will be explained. Not every choice will be comfortable. Not every warning will be followed, but each decision becomes more conscious. Premonition, in the end, doesn't come to take away your freedom. It comes to test what you do with it. After all this, perhaps premonition no longer needs to be explained. Perhaps it simply needs to be respected, not as absolute truth, not as invisible command, but as a sign that consciousness perceives before the mind understands. Spiritism doesn't call this a gift. It doesn't call it a privilege. It calls it a natural faculty of the spirit, present in everyone, active in some, ignored by many. Premonition didn't come to predict the future. It came to qualify the present. It doesn't promise easy paths. It promises more conscious choices. And perhaps the greatest mistake isn't ignoring a warning. It's never asking why it appeared. Because, in the end, premonition doesn't speak about the world outside. It speaks about the level of consciousness with which you live inside. Listening to it doesn't make you special. It makes you responsible, and perhaps that's what's most uncomfortable. If this theme touched something in you, don't answer now. Don't decide now. Just observe. Observe when the body warns. Observe when the mind tries to silence it. Observe what you usually call coincidence, because sometimes silence says more than any explanation. And if there is something the spiritual world deeply respects, it is your freedom to perceive.